It's a great pleasure to welcome Emily Boyd. I've known Emily for a few years. Emily she started out with her PhD at UEA, University of East Anglia, in Norwich, here in the UK. And she was working on forests and conservation and the carbon markets that are emerging in post-Kyoto world, and thinking about how they may intersect with livelihood agendas. And Emily's followed that research on. She went off to Oxford and Leeds doing postdocs, and then moved to Reading, where she took up the lectureship for some years. And then after that, she moved back to her native Sweden, where she took over as director of the Lund Centre for Sustainability Studies, and is now the director of the Bayer Institute at the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. And Emily's work really is leading social science. She's working at the interface of poverty, of livelihoods, and all of these agendas, and how they then intersect with environmental change. And she has a particular focus then on how we manage our forest landscapes and how that intersects with these agendas. So without further ado, Emily, we're delighted that you can speak, and we really look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Dave. That's wonderful. Hello, everybody. I'm Emily. I just wanted to start by saying thanks so much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here today, virtually with you at the Global Wood Security Centre at Cambridge. As Dave said, we've known each other for a long time, so it's really nice to be engaging with Dave and all of you who are working with Dave and connected. And our journey goes a long way back to when we were PhDs. I was in the social science department, and Dave, with several colleagues, was in the ecology, biology department, environmental sciences. And we've always had an amazing dialogue. And I don't know if that was just the times or if it was University of East Anglia that was particularly good at bringing people together. But we've certainly since kept connected, and it's lovely to be here. So I'm going to talk a bit about something that's new, and so I'm really looking forward to our Q&A at the end. So I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to open up for questions. So this work is situated primarily within the sort of social science perspective on how people are relating to changing environment, particularly when it comes to decisions about whether to stay or leave. And what I've tried to do is to connect it a bit to the forests towards the end of the talk. So bear with me if I haven't fully fleshed that out, but I think that can spark some conversation for us to see whether I think there are some really interesting entry points from the forestry perspective that match quite well with the social science. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit from not forest systems, but coastal. We've done a little bit of empirical work on this idea of immobility, but it lends itself well, I think, to forest systems, as I said. So I'm just going to start, if I can move my slides. There we go. So I'm going to start here with just a little comment. I don't know if many of you have read Homer's Odyssey or are familiar with it, but I wanted just to start with a little story, because Odysseus, as you know, he spent many years traveling the seas, out on adventures, and all that time he was trying to get home after the wars he was fighting. When he finally got home, the story didn't really end, and he found that returning wasn't really a resolution, and staying wasn't necessarily peace, and the people he'd left behind had had their own stories, particularly his wife Penelope, who had stayed behind, and she had had to bring up her child, she'd had to fend off suitors, and she was really quite a forgotten figure in the history of the Odyssey. So two things strike me with this story. One is that home is not just a destination, something that we really continuously need to defend, maintain, and live in, as well as those people who were left behind to tend for the island, the livelihoods, the families, and so on. we don't ask ourselves very often what happens to those who stay. So that's where I want to begin today. And it's related to the question of who gets to stay. So in climate change discussions, we often focus on movement. You'll be familiar with what you read in the newspapers about climate change is going to lead to catastrophic effects, and there's going to be mass migration from the global south to the global north. And all this narrative around migration, displacement, relocation, and sort of adaptation through mobility really dominates the way we think about mobility. But in reality, the vast majority of people will not move or do not move. And even if they do move, many other systems that we live with, forests, infrastructures, institutions, remain in place. So what I want to do today is make a simple but important argument that staying is not the absence of movement, but it's a socially produced condition where climate-related losses are lived, they're experienced, and they're also distributed in places. And I'm going to try and show you that this applies not only to coastal communities, but also very much to forest and wood-based systems. So this is my primary question. Who gets to stay in a warming world? Okay, so as I said, most people and most systems stay, despite the discourse that's very, very focused on mobility. The core argument here is that staying is not an absence of movement, but it's socially produced, it's unevenly distributed across places and geographies, and it also generates losses. I'll come back to this towards the end of my talk. So what I'll start off is trying to define what is immobility. Now, I'm not going to define it in terms of what makes an immobile person immobile depending on the time they've been in a location, because I know that all of you are going to pick up on that and going to start asking me very difficult questions. You know, is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? Is it 30 years? But instead, I'm going to suggest something different, that it's not a residual category. It's not what remains when movement fails, but it's a condition in its own right. So I define immobility here as a socially produced staying in place condition. So what that means is that it's contrasting to the mobility framings that exist out there that are based on assumptions that most climate frameworks still begin from movement, and even immobility appears as a deviation or an outcome of mobility. I use this framework not because it's wrong. So if we look at this framework here in terms of our definition, immobility is not a failure to move. It's not a lack of adaptation, and it's not a temporary stasis, but it's a socially produced condition of staying in place, shaped by constraints, shaped by attachments, and shaped by governance and power. So this picture here is from the IPCC sixth assessment report, and it's a paper by a colleague called Nick Simpson, who's tried here to depict what climate mobility is. What I would say is this framework is very useful, but it also has some challenges, because it shows something important here, that even when immobility is included, so in this figure here, involuntary immobility, so that would be the constraints that place you in a situation where you can't move, it's still understood as a mobility condition. So that whatever you do in terms of mobility, it will relate back to the premise that there is mobility. But what I'm trying to argue is that immobility or staying in a place is a condition in itself. So what does that mean? There are different forms of immobility. So the literature has started to define this, coming from both climate change, environmental change, and also migration and mobility studies. What it shows us is there are 3 key ways that we can think about immobility. The first one is the constraint base. So someone who can't move due to lack of resources, due to lack of legal status, for example, lack of networks of information. So here you think this is what you might find when you hear of trapped populations, for example. This is a very common discourse within climate change. I'm sure you will have come across that. But then there's also the attachment-based, more of the voluntary immobility. And this is where I'm particularly interested. So this is where people choose to stay no matter what. And it has to do with their attachment to place. So it has to do with cultural aspects. It has to do with where they get livelihoods. It could also be identity formation or cultural heritage. So this in particular is very interesting in the case of forests, because we see that there are communities that do live and thrive and choose to be in place despite the changing environment around them in forest systems. We have also a category called ambivalent or acquiescent, which is sort of, it would be a person who doesn't really know whether they want to stay or leave. So they're a bit ambivalent about the whole thing. And then you have policy shaping immobility. And this is where you have, for example, emerging relocation restrictions, telling people where they can live or where they can't live now in relation to sea level rise, for example, or where there are particular land use rules or benefit decisions around access resources. So what we can see is that from recent work that we've done, where we've done a review of patterns of immobility in empirical cases across the world, that there is a spatial unevenness to immobility. It's not just an abstract idea, but it is actually patterned and place-based. So what we see here in our study is that the vast majority of strictly immobility-related work has been taking place in Asia, very little in Europe. So we only found one case, which is quite fascinating, and the Caribbean as well. So with the European context, it probably makes sense, right? Because if we think of immobility as trapped populations, as displaced people, as migrant communities, we don't really talk about that within a European context, other than migrant or mobile populations coming into Europe as a result of a changing climate. But we don't actually talk about what kind of movement there is within Europe, or let's say Scandinavia, where I live, in terms of internal movement in relation to climate change. It's not something that's been on the agenda. It's not something that people have even really thought about. And that's why this becomes really interesting to me. So it also relates to issues around who can move and how do people move, like what choices do people really have about staying in place. So this relates to things that we call shaping staying. So it could be something like your subjective, your choice, what you perceive relating to identity, relating to attachment, or the meaning that a place has to you. It could be something, on the other hand, as material. So it's something to do with resources, or you gain a livelihood from the place you're living. And then it can also be considered as structural. So the legal frameworks that allow you to stay, that give you property rights, or it could be also welfare or governance systems that are set up to create some kind of stability to stay in place. It also brings us to questions of power. So power and scale and inequality are really central to immobility work. And I'm going to talk to you a bit about why that is. So basically, immobility is never neutral. It really is shaped by who has the ability to move, who has the ability to stay, or who must stay, and who is also protected in place. So this will become a little bit clearer when I talk about the two case studies in coastal areas. But you could also extrapolate this to forest systems, I think, very much. When you think about conservation, if you're protecting people in place, who's being protected, how are they being protected? Has it ever crossed the minds of those creating those conservation policies that those people want to stay no matter what? So in some contexts, staying might happen because people are not protected. Maybe they're exposed, maybe they're constrained, or maybe they're excluded from options. While in other contexts, people might stay because they're actively protected, And very clear examples in context of climate change would be they're protected through insurance, they're protected through infrastructures, or maybe they're protected through some kind of political influence. So staying can be very different things, and depending on the power and the position that you have in society. So we can think about this in 4 ways. We can think about power over. So that would be, for example, who allocates relocation funds, who allocates funds for infrastructure, and who would allocate funds for protection, who has control over resources. We could think about power too. So this would be capacities to be able to adapt in place. What kind of power do you have in terms of the assets or the services or the social networks that you have to allow you to build capability to remain? That one is particularly interesting in the context of Amazonia, where you have increasing forest fires and drought conditions, but still, in surveys that we've conducted, people still, no matter what, they want to stay in place, in particular because of the social networks that they have in context that sort of outweighs the risks that they have experienced with regards to environmental change. Power within is the third one, and that relates to aspects like dignity or identity or agency. So there, for example, communities that are living on atoll islands, they're very much choosing through their identity to stay in place no matter what, despite sea level rise and despite discussions about building islands adjacent or raising land or moving people, I guess, to Australia. Those communities really do want to stay, particularly older community members who really struggle with the thought of having to lose their homeland and be shifted to some completely new place. Then we have power with. So that's the kind of collective capacity that we might have, collective action, to enable a safer staying in place. So that you might see where communities maybe join together, maybe there's some kind of resistance, some pushback on policies that are trying to move people out of at-risk locations. So this also relates to the issue of scale and where scale really matters. So at household level, we call it the micro level. Decisions are really shaped often by income, by networks and family ties. So there we can start to see the immobility decisions that are taken at an individual household level. Then at the meso level, the sort of mid-level, which is often overlooked, we can start to understand the meso level better now with sort of network analysis, social network analysis to find that missing middle, so to speak. That would be sort of services, labor markets, or where land use planning or planning takes place. And those are actually really important decisions when it comes to the influences of people's choices whether to stay or go. And then at the macro level, we're talking more about national level. We're talking about things like insurance systems and governance that influences climate governance. So we could say that immobility is not just spatial, as we've seen in our review paper, where we looked at the geographical spread of immobility, but it's also deeply multi-scalar. So across all of this, we see that inequality across these scales and the power dynamic shapes who has options and whose matter. So now I'm going to turn briefly to my 2 coastal cases. I'll hop there. There we go. So I'm going to talk briefly about 2 coastal regimes of staying. And I just wanted to infuse here a little bit of empirics and case study work, because I think that sheds light on what I'm really talking about. So the first case here is work that we've had funded by Formas, our research council in Sweden, where we've been looking at the question of why people who are living in informal settlements that are highly exposed to flood extremes and increasingly heat as well, in a place where you have about 1 million inhabitants and it's a major tourist center. A lot of North American tourists travel there. There's a beautiful center to Cartagena. It's got a fascinating history, and it's kind of like a hub for all the world's challenges, in fact. Here you have informal settlements that face recurrent flooding and coastal erosion, and you've got many households that have insecure tenures. So they have limited formal protection, they have weak access to insurance or state support, and where they live is often unplanned settlements. So there's not a clear land tenure ownership. There are very basic services, if any, and the infrastructure is very limited. In the communities where we've done field work, it's predominantly Afro-Caribbean communities that are disproportionately affected by these climate events due to poverty, race, gender, and age, but also poor planning at the root of it. So we've done a survey here of about 300 people to reveal that people are very aware of the heightened risks that they're facing by environmental change, but they don't self-identify as purely vulnerable. They demonstrate coping resilience, they demonstrate collective action, and they do this through maintaining their homes, improving their infrastructures autonomously, and also navigating their social networks. So basically, in this context, residents choose to stay partly because of economic incentive, partly because of community ties, and partly because of informal ownership. So within this context, staying often means exposure. So it means living with repeated losses, and often without compensation or without any protection directly. We turn then to look at our contrasting example here. And this is comparing now with Falsterbo in Sweden. I think, Dave, you might have been here to do some bird watching. So you can see here on the map, this is a peninsula right in the southern tip of Sweden, where we see coastal risk and sea level rise and storm surges increasing. The context is obviously very, very different. Here, we're talking about property values that are extremely high. These properties are some of the highest in Scandinavia and definitely in Sweden. And they also call this the Riviera of Sweden. So you can imagine there's legal protections that are extremely strong, and adaptation is often supported by infrastructures and private investments, and obviously insurance as well. But in both of these cases, people want to stay. They're extremely different contexts, they're extremely different conditions. But we could say that on some level, they're both experiencing climate risk. And we're also saying that they have experiences of staying that maybe are quite different depending on the context, but also there are some similarities there. But first of all, in Cartagena, staying is often framed as vulnerability or even as a failure to adapt. While in Falsterbo, staying is framed as something legitimate, it's framed as something protected. So we see in this case that immobility is not simply about exposure to risk. It's also about how risk is distributed, how it's governed, and how it's compensated. And this leads us then to a more fundamental political question. Who is then absorbing the risk? Who is able to shift, or how is this redistributed elsewhere? So on this slide here, it's just a very brief summary here of these two very interesting contrasting cases, where on the one hand, we think about immobility as a failure to adapt. So people are stuck, people cannot move, people don't have the option. That's the narrative around the dispossession of people in Cartagena who are left at risk. Even though our research shows that it's much more complex and that people are choosing to stay for a variety of reasons. Then we have the Falsterbo case where we have these high value properties, very strong property rights, and where nevertheless there's some sense of entitlement to being protected, to being defended, to being insured, to being politically heard. There's a lot of influence from these very wealthy communities who see themselves as having a right to protection. So this is what I'm saying is, who is left to the risk? Who is protected? You know, how do we frame this? Is it abandonment, or do we see it as some kind of mobilization and ability to mobilize? And then what that can tell us about immobility is that it's a socially produced, it's contextually influenced, and it has a meaning of itself. So this is my argument anyway for why I study this. So then if we turn to in my last sort of 20 minutes here, to talk about how this relates maybe to forests and wood security. And I don't want this to be sort of too artificial or just as an add-on, because I think this is where actually immobility becomes even more interesting. Because actually, if we put it in the context of forests or wood security, immobility is not only about people. So we move from coast to forests, and we can think, okay, can we reframe immobility here? Because we could say that it's not just a human, but it's also built into a social ecological system. So if we look at forests, we can see that they are long-lived ecosystems. So they operate on very long timescales, right? And ecological and economic and institutional aspects so that are deeply embedded around forests and governance systems that assume, I would argue, stability, argues for sustained yield in forests. It sits within carbon accounting, certification schemes, and land use planning. So all of this says to me that immobility has a very important role to play here in trying to better understand how we expect forests to stay put. Well, they do obviously stay put, but the whole system around forests also is created to make sure they stay put. Yet we have the big challenge now with climate change. What is climate change doing? Well, it's having an effect on maybe what we could call something called a stability contract in forests. In social sciences, we talk about social contract. So I'm just kind of making this up a bit, but I think there might be something in here. In the social contract that we have as people, we have agreed ways that we live and relate to one another, but also to the rules and structures around us. So I think there might be some kind of way that we relate to forests, not necessarily in the social contract, but some kind of stability contract where we expect forests to remain productive. We expect them to deliver continuous yield. And we also expect them to provide predictable carbon and wood supply. So what that says then is that despite this, a changing climate is creating some kind of disturbance. And I guess the disturbance here is not just to the actual material, physical reality of forests, but it's also to the assumptions that I just argued that we have about creating the infrastructures and the systems that keep forests in place. So we can see, I think you'd all agree with me, that disturbances are increasing. And as such, maybe this disturbance through climate change, intersecting with obviously local drivers of land use change and social economic drivers, we're seeing an increase in forest fires, the effects of pests, drought and storms. So you can see burning forests, you can see drying forests or dieback of forests, you can see shifting species compositions, and I guess there's a failure to regenerate predictably, which is important for you guys in the Wood Security Centre. I just picked up a picture here from Lund University, a field study that's been done in the new MGO department, where they've looked at, on physical geography, where they've looked at how forest fires in Sweden across, I think, 50 different sites from the 2018 extreme forest fires, how they have affected forests. And they've shown that those forest fires did have a direct impact on the regeneration of forests. So what happens then? As we see disturbances increasing, we also see governance systems failing to stabilize forests at the same time as trying to stabilize them. And you'll get this, maybe what we would call a paradox here between trying to maintain a continuous wood supply or whatever it is you want from the forests. At the same time, we have this uncertainty and instability in systems taking place. So maybe we could argue that because wood security depends on systems that are increasingly ecologically unstable, immobility here is going to take a different form. People who stay in those regions where we're depending on wood supplies, their livelihoods are directly dependent on the forests. For example, they are immobile, such. Industries stay no matter what because the infrastructures and the capital are locked into those places. And also we can see that states often invest in keeping forest systems productive and stable. It has a vested interest in doing that. That links me back to immobility here is not just a human feat, but it's also a social, ecological one, and one that demonstrates the paradox that we find ourselves in between stability and instability. So in my last few slides here, it brings me on then to this instability, what it might lead to, and what immobility can tell us about the losses that are being incurred to people and forests. So what you might want to, what you would probably think about in the way you are framing this social ecological immobility, that people are actively engaged. For example, here I took this lovely photo from your website, that the livelihood dependency of people, for example, forest workers or people who stay where forests sustain themselves, are in a sense immobile. They are choosing to be immobile. The institutional lock-ins here, where you have forest policy frameworks that aim to stabilize landscape, those institutional lock-ins could also be thought of as a strategy to create immobility. And then we can think about the capital investments. So the industry infrastructure, or the fixes to production in place, is also being organized as a way to create some kind of immobility. So we could argue at the end of that staying as a result is organized. But yes, as I mentioned, this may lead to, so this kind of relationship between the immobility and the uncertainty or the disruption, ultimately there is some kind of residual risk or fallout from this. And we see this increasingly when we look at empirically at the impacts. I mean, you guys look at tons of work on biodiversity loss. That's not a new thing, but maybe what you've started looking at is loss of yields or production, forest production, as influenced by these different climate drivers. So it's starting to come into the forestry discourse to some extent. So this is both an element of the economic losses that we might find associated with climate change. And that would be things like declining yields, maybe unstable livelihoods, or loss of productivity in places. So just to make the point here that when we think of immobility in relation to loss and damage, it's really where the accumulation of losses are going to be felt. They are going to be felt among people who stay in place in a particular way, I would say. And it's not only the events that matter, but it also influences the conditions of staying in place. So those forest workers who want to stay, to build those nurseries, to replant the forests, under these, let's say, uncertainties and changing dynamics or disruptions, they too then are faced with this choice about staying or leaving. And they probably really, really want to stay in that place. So we can then think about the effects on the non-economic aspects of the losses incurred. So that would be things like loss of identity. When a place changes, we can think about what effect loss of forests, impacts of climate change has on those forest communities over time. How does it really affect their sense of place? How does it really affect the relationships that they have with forests? And if we're going to sort of translate this into something policy relevant, we would need to be thinking about how do we create adaptation and mitigation strategies that really consider these nuances of those who want to stay, those who want to leave. And also to consider them if we're going towards some kind of sort of transformational change, how that relates to one another, how that relates to one another. So how immobility, the choice to stay, the changing environment relates to the decisions that are going to be taken at different scales. And I guess very importantly here, and very central to the losses incurred or the accumulation of losses in the context of immobile populations, is the institutional or governance failure to be able to provide sufficient resources or capacity or actual structure for adaptation. And I feel very passionate about this because it's not just a global South issue. We're failing across globally in terms of adaptation currently. And we're failing to really anticipate, and we're failing to really think about what might be some of the negative consequences for climate change that we won't be able to come back from, and how we need to be very proactive and very constructive in engaging and trying to engage policymakers in here. So I don't feel like I've given up hope as such, but I think that we need to go out with very strong messages and have very constructive dialogue with policymakers about this. This kind of research that we're doing is very new to policymakers. We have to translate it in ways they understand, and they often come to say, yeah, I get all of this, but you need to translate it into what kind of actions do we need to take to push this forward. So that's our challenge, to translate all of this into very concrete, simple action points for decision makers. So I guess in my last 7 minutes, I would just make this extra point, is that there is a hidden dynamic here. I think this is why policymakers maybe are a bit adverse to engage. You need the evidence, you need the measurement, but you also need to be able to see what is being lost, and it's often accumulating. It's often gradual. It's not abrupt in the way on small scales, in the way that you might see these iconic events happening from time to time. Damage is also normalized, particularly with the insurance approach that we take. So how do we move beyond that and reveal also that staying in place maybe also masks the crisis that is currently ongoing? So I would end with that comment by saying maybe what doesn't move is harder to see. And I wonder if that's the same for trees, because trees don't move. It's harder to see them. It's harder to make them a subject that's as exciting as maybe pandas or other things that do move. I don't know. It just comes to mind. So just to wrap up then in my last couple of minutes here, or my last minute, is that staying isn't the opposite of migration. Staying or immobility, as I'm framing it, is not a polarized opposite of mobility. There's a relationship between them. It's like a spectrum, you go back and forth. But there are some particularly interesting questions to ask around why people stay no matter what, as opposed to just asking the question, why are people not able to move if they want to, which is the trapped populations discourse, or the discourse which is saying that changing forests, changing climate is going to lead to mass migration and a mass mobility, which is going to lead to very unintended negative consequences. That dramatization is not really fair if it's used in the wrong way. So the question then is, what happens to the majority of people who want to stay, or majority of people who would want to adapt in context, who would want to protect their forest systems, who would want to steward and nurture the place where they live, no matter what? Can we understand better what is driving those kinds of decisions to be able to build on that? Staying or immobility, I would argue, is a political condition. It's also a social ecological arrangement. I hope I managed to convince you through this talk that it's not just about people, but it's also about nature, it's about forests, and it's also a site, immobility, I guess, where climate-related losses and damages are distributed unevenly. So there are different places around the world where the effect of climate is going to be different depending on many factors, but that will also have an influence on people's choices to stay, or not necessarily the choices, because I feel like I'm contradicting myself here, but I think it will have an influence on the quality of the choice people have. So just to finish off then, the key question perhaps then is not who moves, but who stays. And going beyond that, who ultimately is made to carry the costs of staying is maybe the final question. I would end on there. And I think that's it for me. And thank you very much. My 40 minutes is up, and I really look forward to hearing questions from you. So I'll leave it at that and open the floor. Thank you.
Hello, Emily. Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Yes. Is everyone in shock by my talk and it's gone silent?
Thank you. It was fascinating. And already Ida has put her hand up for a talk. So we welcome you to ask your question, Ida. And if anyone wants to just type their question in the chat box, I'll keep an eye on that as well. But Ida, would you like to take the first question?
Thanks, Emily, and thanks for a great talk. It was very inspiring. So maybe I'll just briefly introduce myself. So I work at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, and I work a lot on forest, from the ecology side, but also on the social side. And I'm currently also having a project of mangroves and on coastal communities. So it was very inspiring for me because we just finished the field work there. So it's like, oh, wow, there's a lot more literature I can use and so on. But actually, I mean, I have a million questions I could ask, but I'll just ask maybe one that is a little bit more challenging and see, because I'm interested in your viewpoint. So on the mobility. So I want to challenge the what you mentioned. And yeah, I mean, it's not that I disagree. I just want to bring up a kind of particular example that it's a little bit strange, just to see what is your view on that. So we also work with indigenous people in the Congo Basin of Pygmy origin, although, of course, this is not a very politically correct term these days. So let's say hunter-gatherer groups. And actually what I want to bring up is that they're fighting for mobility. So let me see if I can put this in a way. So traditionally they were mobile, so they were moving in the forest, and because of many things that happen, especially national parks were created, farmer population has increased a lot over time, and also there's been a lot of politics in, people that move in the forest don't exist because it's hard to know where they are, how many are there. We don't even have good estimates of how many are there. And yeah, so I was just thinking, some of the things you said could also be turned around in a way that certain cultural groups, like these hunter-gatherers, it goes against their own culture to be sedentary and to be. So it's not that they're not affected by climate change. On the contrary, our research shows that their non-timber forest products and the way they use forests has changed a lot, partially because of climate change, but also because of lack of access to certain resources. And so I was just wondering, what would be your view? Do you think that at the same time that your work shows how important is it to consider immobility in climate change adaptation, we also need to acknowledge that some groups are inherently mobile, and actually by reducing their mobility, we are constraining their options as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ida. I think that's an excellent question, and I'm really excited to hear about your work. So it'd be interesting to follow up after. I think it depends on, I guess, at what scale we're talking about, because I guess we could talk about this group as a immobile population, if you see what I mean, because they have, in the context of where they live, they're not moving out of the forest system, right? They're not moving into the city, for example. So they are kind of immobile within the system that they choose to be within. So I would say that they're sort of choosing to stay no matter what, because they've been through a lot, I imagine. And they're immobile in the sense of fighting for their rights to be in that place at the same time as to choose where to go and when to go within that. So I don't think those things are in conflict. I think it actually adds a nuance to immobility that is really important. And I think that would be like, if we were to look at the range of immobilities that might exist, it might go from indigenous populations who move in the forest to people who are on islands where you can't really move that much and it's kind of more constrained, but that both those examples show that it's the inherent nature of wanting or choosing to stay or experience certain constraints to the movement that make that immobility a very interesting way to talk about populations or people groups. You're nodding, so it is resonate what I'm saying a bit. Yeah, okay, that's good. Did you have any follow-up questions, or maybe you can come back later if you have further questions?
Emily, I think I really buy this concept that, of course, socio-ecological systems in forests, they're immovable for a range of different scales, right from the local person's choice through to business investments, through to governments around forestry systems. You suggested, though, at the end that policymakers want, or I think you were talking about policymakers want simple kind of policies that they could follow could be suggested. At what scale do you think in a forestry system we as interested in this space should be focusing our efforts in trying to change the kind of the way that we interact with these systems?
Thanks, Dave. A very easy question. So I would say, so different people are going to be working at different scales at all times. So I guess the question is, who are we talking about? But let's say someone like you who've been working on this for a long time, or me. I would say that maybe we spent quite a lot of our time in a very local context to understand that local context and to kind of bring that local context into a wider discussion for policy. So I think that does have merit still, that you provide a lot of evidence in detail and context-specific understandings in a simple form for policymakers to at least consider. But I also think increasingly that it's very important to go to actors that have power to make change in the system. So to address maybe companies or insurance or those who are making money from forests, to try and also engage with those groups, or at least understand the relationship at that macro scale with what is happening at the micro level much better. Because I think that if we're only, and I don't know if I'm addressing your question correctly here, but this is certainly my own thinking, where we've done a lot of focus on sort of local ethnography and institutional understanding and so on, to understand the constraints, etc. Increasingly looking towards, let's say, other actors, and we call it studying up. So we're looking at understanding companies or particular actors that have resources or power, going back to my sort of list of power, to influence change. So understanding those groups and engaging with them as well. So kind of having a dual approach increasingly. Yeah, I don't know if that answers or that is related to what you
it
just
obviously is a complex issue that
what do you think,
with.
Dave? What do you think, Dave? I mean, you've worked a lot within local contexts and with local decision makers, I guess, and maybe country level.
On the one hand, it's nice to think that we can talk to the highest policymakers, but actually I think often our biggest gains can be made at more local scale, where we've built those relationships, etc. Of course, those are big gains local, but we're dealing with a 1.5 billion hectare forestry system. So I guess from an academic perspective, it's always a challenge to think about how much time one should be investing in trying to engender change versus provide scientific evidence for those changes.
Yes. Yeah, I guess it's knowing where the sort of boundaries are of our own capacity as researchers and scientists. It takes an awful lot of time. Yeah.
I was going to say, I did think we also should be aware of the slightly more difficult geopolitical system we find ourselves in, working at higher level. Some of the budgets that were available, and I think you've talked a bit about loss and damage, so I'll finish with another question, but could you perhaps mention briefly, for those that were not aware, of what the loss and damage fund was, and then what your thoughts are about how well invested that may or may not become in the coming years?
Yes, I can do that, because I didn't go into detail on that. I can do that in a future discussion on loss and damage. But for now, for those of you who don't know, there's a new loss and damage response fund that's been set up under the UNFCCC, and it's being developed, currently hosted by the World Bank. And that fund came about in a gap in terms of the most vulnerable countries experiencing the most severe climate impacts, and there being no direct way to either assess that or to compensate. So this fund is sort of a middle way. It's called like a kind of agreed ambiguity of what loss and damage is, but it's related to basically what I mentioned earlier. It's like the residual risk. What is left over when you try to adapt or you've tried to mitigate? What is left over? Those impacts can then be supported financially by this new fund that's being set up. That's in a nutshell. So it's not vast sums of money, but it is a start in terms of millions of dollars for communities that are now starting to apply for these funds. So it's basically setting up a whole new institutional framework for trying to support countries at risk from climate change and where adaptation is failing. So I can also say within there is the specific sort of ecological losses and damages. Actually, Dave and myself and some colleagues here have been trying to refine a little bit what that might look like specifically, because obviously ecological loss and damage falls into both the economic and the non-economic categories, right? So you have, as I mentioned earlier, you have both, recovery costs for lost timber, for example, after forest fires, and in places where there isn't any insurance. And then you would also have recovery of like lost land or lost sort of cultural dimensions due to, let's say, sort of erosion of community networks or whatever it may be resulting from events. So forests fit in there nicely again. But it's going to be a long process of developing the architecture, let's say, for that kind of funding. There's opportunities to influence that, obviously, then amongst researchers to try and define better what this is. Or that's the bit, Dave, where I would say trying to produce some good science is important, as it's very lacking.
Dom, you've got a question.
Yeah, I was sort of just thinking about some situations where, say, like forestry or logging companies move into an area, and I guess those can provide sort of short-term gains in the scenario, both for logging companies and the people who maybe gain additional employment, who would perhaps, in vulnerable positions otherwise. But then, and both those companies use sort of phrases like being immobile within that forest system. But then, I guess long term, as say a primary or secondary forest begins to be degraded more and more, companies which are at global scale can then have the capacity to move out and leave those sort of communities in worsened positions. I was just wondering what sort of policy levers have you been looking at to sort of try and, I guess, reconcile that sort of temporal inequality in relation to like the scale of degradation and the fact that it can provide short-term benefit, but then obviously more long-term like negative impacts.
Yeah, so I haven't myself looked at that specifically, but I would say the first thing that comes to mind is responsibility and accountability, a corporate responsibility, for example, trying to get into their plans and their actions or social environmental impact assessments, this dimension of potential losses and also the rights aspect, which is relating to immobility, like how will they compensate those communities over time with increasing multiple drivers of impact, right? Because I would imagine that they have their environmental impact assessments are based on probably quite some old scenarios of the world. I don't know. And also maybe try to sometimes like limit the amount of resources they provide to communities. They might build a school or they might do something short term, but actually here there is a possible bridge to long term. The question there then is what's in it for them over the long term if they're not going to sort of revisit sites if once the extraction's done. I think there you need some kind of actual accountability mechanism safeguarding communities about these new, let's say, stresses that are coming from climate change, and using that kind of language of that's set out now, for example, in the International Court of Justice, that countries at least have responsibility to reduce the harms caused to people in climate-related contexts. So I'm using that kind of those kind of mechanisms to hold accountable companies, I think will become increasingly important, and companies and states. But maybe that's where the climate litigation and the general rights to nature discussions are going to come in over time much more strongly. I know that some of the cases, or we've been looking at some of the cases on climate change, and they're still very nascent stage, but it's definitely an emerging area where they will be used as tools, I think, in the future to be able to hold accountable. So the more evidence that you guys provide also in terms of the effects of deforestation or loss of species or climate interactions with it, the more you do also on showing that, I think the economic losses are quite important. Back to Dave's question about who to target, I think they do take notice of the costs, the economic costs, and then those who who collaborate with, like social scientists like myself, we really want to look at the non-economic side of things, just to add that all up into a portfolio of evidence, let's say, over time, to be able to better understand, better track, better hold accountable, better compensate, and all those things.
All right. Well, I think we've run out of time now, Emily. So thank you so much for.
Oh, we have. Oh, that was
we
brilliant.
have.
Sorry if I rambled on, guys. I really enjoyed it, and I hope you did too.
Yes, thank you so much, Emily. It's been a
So
real pleasure.
we'll see you soon and have a lovely afternoon. I hope you're going to get a nice cup of tea or something now.
Thank you.
Okay.
Goodbye, Emily. Take care.
Bye. See you soon. Bye bye.